Henry VI became King of England at the age of just 9 months old. He never knew his father, and in many ways would never truly grow up. His life was managed by a series of competing and often self-serving councillors. His many mental health issues placed incredible pressure on the court that he nominally oversaw. And thanks to his eventual overthrow at the hands of Edward, Earl of March, later Edward IV, we think of Henry as a largely inept, useless and pitiful figure. But was he? Well, to discuss this fascinating man, I'm pleased to welcome back Lauren Johnson onto the podcast for a discussion all about him. Lauren's book, Shadow King, The Life and Death of Henry VI, acts as the basis of our conversation. We discuss his earliest days, what the cause of his mental breakdowns were, Lauren's feelings on how he died, and debate what his life might have been like had he known the father that he is so unfavourably compared to. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 107, Shadow King, The Life and Death of Henry VI, with Lauren Johnson. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast. Lauren Johnson, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Adam. Very, very sleepy. Always very sleepy. Whatever time of day, night, month, season. Anytime someone asks me how I am on a podcast, that's my answer.
Yeah. Well, you've got a lot on your plate at the moment. You've just... is Margaret Beaufort... It is out now, isn't it, the Margaret Beaufort book, or is it imminent?
6th of November, so I think people who have pre-ordered should have them mid-October, so depending when this is out. Who knows? It could be in their little paws.
Well, we're here today to actually talk about a man that you wrote a book about a while ago, Henry VI. I'm really interested in this discussion because he's such a fascinating figure. Before we get into the discussion, though, a few questions for people to get to know you a bit better. So can I start by asking you where you grew up and what it is that you now do full-time?
I grew up in Bristol, and full-time I juggle 5 million jobs in Brighton now. I'm your classic freelancer, basically. Freelance historian, whatever that means.
Nice. Whereabouts are you based in Brighton?
5 Ways, up to the north.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know it well. It's where I went to university.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it seems... Oh, yeah. I've only been here like 3 years. I love it.
Yeah, I lived there for 5 years, between 2005 and 2010. Brilliant place to live. So, given today's conversation, if you could jump in a time travel machine and witness a single moment from Henry VI's life, what would you choose?
This is so hard, Adam. Because he's around for 50 years, and for most of that he's a king, or trying to be a king from exile. And yeah, I mean, there's actually maybe the thing I'd be most interested to know is what was actually going on with him when he suffered his, as we'd probably call it today, psychotic break from 1453 to 5. Like, it would be really interesting, as I'm sure we're going to cover, like the sources for it are very scant. So it'd be really interesting to know exactly what was going on behind closed doors.
Yeah, and we'll definitely come to that because it is such a weird, fascinating, and ultimately quite elusive for us period of his reign. I mean, it's just so unusual at what happens. But yeah, we will come to that. And if you had the opportunity to ask Henry VI a single question, what would it be?
I think I'd just like to know what he wanted to do with his life, because I think we assume that he wanted to be a monk or he wanted to have a religious life. But my feeling with him has always been that he very profoundly felt the obligation he had as king. And that was kind of part of his problem, was he was trying to do a good job the whole time and not. So yeah, I think I'd like to just know, what did you want to do, Henry? If you had free choice, what would you do?
And the book that you wrote, so it's called Shadow King, The Life and Death of Henry VI. Why this story? What was it that made you want to tell the story of King Henry VI in particular? And I love the title, by the way, because Shadow King is really apt. It tells you his story in a way.
Thank you very much. I'm not very good at coming up with book titles, so I'm quite proud of that one. And it comes from a contemporary quote, I think by Georges Chastelain, who's a contemporary chronicler, who describes him as being like a shadow on the wall. And yeah, again, that's exactly it. He's just such an elusive figure. And how I came to him was kind of two different ways. One was his queen, Margaret of Anjou, because women in the 15th century have, for a very long time, been my area of interest. But Margaret has been written about sort of more recently, including by the brilliant Helen Castor. Sarah Gristwood did a whole history of women in the wars about 10 years ago. Whereas Henry actually hadn't kind of had a really big popular history of him for quite a, for a really long time, I'd say, like a very fulsome narrative history. So it was partly that, in that I wanted to see how their dynamic worked. And then also it was the mental health aspect, because I've had mental health troubles. 1 in 4 of us statistically do. And it always really bugged me that he was being described as like mad king, weak king. And I was like, no, come on, like, there's more to people than just their mental health. What else was going on? How did he come to suffer the various mental health challenges he had? And I really wanted to kind of do him a bit of justice, I think.
Yeah. Which I think makes complete sense. I mean, we'll come on to the stuff around his potential mental break later, but it is so true that it's just an aspect of his story, not his story in total. And I mean, the book you wrote is a beast of a book. It's amazing. How long were you working on it? Because it's a big book.
I think it was about 3 years. So actually a lot less than I've ended up working on Margaret Beaufort. But then, you know, there wasn't a global plague, so that slowed everything down. 3 years. And I would say a good year of that, I was like, what have I done? How am I going to do this?
Yeah, there's always that, isn't there, with a new project? You just think, what have I agreed to? And I'm never ever going to be able to do this.
Yeah, and it's such an odd one because for kings, there are so many sources, like even medieval kings, so much material to sift through. And yet at the same time with Henry, for a long time, you're not really sure if what you're looking at, you know, parliamentary records, council ordinances, statutes, letters that are officially signed by the king, is it really Henry? Because for a long time he's a child with a council ruling for him. Then it's quite questionable exactly when he takes power for himself. Then he is infamously under the sway of other influential figures around him. So it's like, well, you had this added layer, I think, to it of constantly questioning. Okay, so it would appear that Henry is being very forthright here. Doesn't really sound like him, though. Could this, in fact, be someone else around him who's kind of forcing this message on him? And
to that point, he does have the distinction of being the youngest king in English history to accede to the throne, and I stress English because Mary, Queen of Scots, became the Queen of Scotland at 6 days old. But he does have the English distinction. He becomes king at 9 months old. Now, I assume that this was viewed as a bit of a total disaster at court. Would have that been the case?
I mean, yes, probably. What's interesting, though, is that we don't really see it at the time. What we see at first around Henry, and I would argue actually like into the Wars of the Roses, is people collectively, and by people I particularly mean the nobility, the lords and bishops, collectively gathering around him and making a concerted effort to protect him and to, in particular, protect the legacy of his father, Henry V. And I think that, again, is a bit kind of the core of Henry VI's problem, is that he never knew his father. He literally never met him. His father had already gone back to France by the time he was born. He never saw what a king was. But he would have grown up constantly hearing this kind of mythologizing that happened with Henry V very early on. And also constantly being divided between this council of very strong individuals with different ideas of how the country should be run, you know, how the war with France, this is the time of the 100 Years' War, how that should be fought, who will fight it. So, yeah, a really complicated and confusing situation to grow up in, I think.
And I'm curious for your opinion on whether you think Henry V is somewhat overrated in terms of his success as a king.
I think it depends how you see kingship. I feel for a medieval king, he's probably pretty great. I mean, wins lots of battles, great. But he only leaves one son. And given that we spend a lot of time, I feel like, in history, sort of casting women failing to have children as a failure, like, that is a big failing on his part. And that's his choice because he doesn't marry for a long time. Like, I think he's one of the oldest bachelor kings in English history. Up until that point is my memory. I think it's him and Richard I basically get married in their 30s. So, that is a problem. At the time, he probably thought it would be okay because he had a lot of brothers. By sort of weird chance, none of the brothers have legitimate sons. So actually, there's a real problem in the Lancastrian dynasty as a result. And also, like, looking through 21st century lenses, I mean, he's a king who causes atrocities. There's not really any other way to see it. His treatment of, like, Rouen, for instance, which he pounds with a 6-month siege, to the extent that when the people of Rouen try to release some of the useless mouths, as they are called, the women, the children, the sick, the elderly, they are just thrown out of the city and not allowed through Henry V's military lines and left to die in the middle, like in the depths of winter. And you're like, how can you be doing that to a country you are allegedly seeing yourself as overlord of? And then, of course, there's lots of arguments about Agincourt and his treatment of prisoners of war and things. So, yeah, I think he's a really problematic figure, and I definitely don't think we should, kind of buy into the Shakespearean hero worship version of him. He needs to be questioned.
Yeah, well, there's also the fundamental fact that those wars all but bankrupt England as well. So I think there's also that lens that we should view him through, is the financial side of things as well, that, there was all of this glory, but it had to be paid for. And that was something that I think was going to greatly impact the success of his son's reign as well.
Absolutely. And there's no way around it. Like, Henry V's legacy was a huge problem for Henry VI. And Henry V would have changed his mind, I think, about how the war was going to be run. But the trouble is he died leaving a will that was really sort of stringent and militant, and was like, do not release the prisoners of war from Agincourt, so they're left in prison for 20 years. Do not make a deal with France without XYZ things being in it. These people will be in control. And it just completely kind of handcuffs Henry VI and the people ruling for him, because they feel like they have to do what Henry V wanted. Yeah. Whereas it would have been a lot more sensible for him to be like, you know what, maybe adjust to the changing times as they arise.
Well, obviously a 9-month-old baby is not going to be making decisions for himself or for the kingdom. So who were the key figures in the minority rule council? And I trust that they seldom will have all gotten along very well.
Oh, yeah, they definitely didn't get along. And even within Henry's family, that's a big problem. There are a lot of big figures, but like the most important ones, especially during Henry VI's early years, are his uncles, John, Duke of Bedford, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and his great uncle, Cardinal Henry Beaufort. And what's interesting is each of those three figures kind of has a different power base, a different focus. But yeah, they never agree on anything. So Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, kind of wants to be the regent of England, and everyone says no, because the English are not very keen on regency. So he's left in this slightly weird deputy protector situation. But he is a very aggressive, militant figure who wants to go and fight the wars with France, who refuses to consider peace processes unless England is completely in the ascendant. Then there's John, Duke of Bedford, the elder brother, who is... really, I think, has had quite a poor reputation historically. I think he deserves a lot more than he's got. He was a very reasonable individual. And whenever he was in England, he would take priority over Gloucester as protector of England. But most of the time he was in France trying to fight the 100 Years' War and rule what was called the dual monarchy of England and France. So he's like a really important European figure. But unfortunately, he probably would have been the best influence on Henry and was never there because he was fighting the wars. And then as for Cardinal Henry Beaufort, he is just the richest man in the country. That's like where his power base lies. He's phenomenally rich. As a churchman, he does lots of diplomatic services. He's often referred to as the stirrer to the peas, because that's how they spell peace, which I always find hilarious. So yeah, there's these three of them constantly vying for control of the person of Henry, because each of them knows that if you control the body of the king, you control two kingdoms at this time. And that leads on occasion to actual pitched battle or threats of duels being made in council. Like, it's a really turbulent family dynamic.
So was Henry sort of wheeled out for ceremonial occasions? You know, like, I'm picturing a sort of totally oblivious baby being carried into a room with whole audience dropping to bows and curtsies. Did that happen at all?
Yeah. Loads.
Okay.
I mean, just again and again, he's brought to Parliament on his mother's lap when he's a baby. He, I think even when he's like a year old, he passes the Great Seal of the Chancellor from one figure to another. You know, this little baby fingers sort of passing this badge of office. And I think that's part of the problem, because he sees that as being a king. He sees kind of like, he's really good at sitting still for 6 hours through a really long mass while, you know, statecraft is going on around him. And he's also very good at asking people to be friends and to shake hands or kiss each other and get on. But he doesn't have that kind of steel core that Henry V had to him. He doesn't have it. And I think part of that is because it was really discouraged in him when he was younger.
And at what stage in Henry's childhood, as best we can tell, did he begin to be given more of a role to play in the governance of England and his overseas territories?
It's really difficult to know, is the quick answer. He's crowned when he's still a child. I think he's 9 and 10 or 8 and 9. He's crowned in England and also in France. But he doesn't rule then because he's still too young. When he's about 12, 13, he sort of starts to try and take a bit more control for himself, but the council feel he's too young. I think they're worried about having a kind of Richard II figure, you know, this tyrant medieval king on their hands. Yep. So they're like, no, you cannot. Which I think has a really big impression on Henry, that he kind of goes, oh, well, I think I should rule. You don't. Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah. I won't trust my judgment. So it's actually kind of in his late teens that it happens, probably by the time he's 18, because he founds Eton College as a symbol of his having come to power and a kind of Thanksgiving act. And that happens in 1440 from memory. So by then, but that is quite late, you know, late teenager, given he has ruled, as you said, since he was 9 months old.
You just mentioned there as well the fact that he is crowned twice. He's crowned in France, and he is the only English king to actually be crowned as King of France. So how much of France as we know it today did he occupy, and how was that process managed?
It varies over time. I'd say at its fullest extent, it was from kind of Calais and the Pale through the Duchy of Normandy, which had quite ancestral associations with England, down through Anjou, Maine, right down the kind of western seaboard to Gascony. And then the middle and the east was pretty much always kind of under real French control, I'd say. And then the status of Brittany is something that's quite interesting, because Brittany is a kind of independent duchy at this time. But Henry is related to one of the leading figures of Brittany, and they become very close. And, you know, he's, again, a sort of forgotten figure in history who I think is quite interesting, Gilles of Brittany, who gets horribly murdered, in fact. So it's never France as we would understand it, but it is like vast sweeps of country, and it's basically maintained by military occupation. Like, that's the only way they're holding it. So you have kind of lieutenant governors of France and Normandy, usually based in Normandy itself, who are kind of sitting in their castles and sending out military individuals. Among those are the Duke of Somerset, the Duke of Suffolk, and the Duke of York. They all fulfill that role at some point. So these are like the really leading individuals.
Because obviously this is also the window of history in which Joan of Arc is on the scene and is eventually put to the flames during the reign of Henry VI. It was these men ultimately that led to her destruction, right?
Yeah, a little. They're a little bit later, those ones,
Okay.
kind of in their ascendancy. What's interesting, I think, and there must be a play to write about this, is that in 1432, Henry VI, as part of his coronation procession through France, stops in Rouen Castle, which is where Joan of Arc is being held captive. So you have all of these very adult things going on with her being mistreated and sexually harassed and all sorts of awful things that are being done to her, literally in the same building that this little child king is like, la, 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 la. Oh, isn't it lovely to be king? Here I go, bimbling about. Why don't my people love me? Yeah, so I'd say the Duke of Bedford is probably one of the key figures who helps bring down Joan of Arc. So that's Henry's uncle.
To talk about the factionalism among Henry's chief advisors, you mentioned the three leading figures a moment ago. Were they always at each other's throats? I'm assuming also that sort of each of those men, they have had their own retainers, their own supporters, their own network, effectively. Were these people always clashing?
No, they weren't always clashing. I think things start to fall apart. I mean, partly with Henry VI taking power for himself and proving really rubbish at making decisions, and partly because the French have a much more successful military fight back from the late 1440s into 1450. Like, there is just absolute collapse of the English position in France. And actually, the French aspect of all this kind of gets a bit ignored, I think, in the Wars of the Roses. But actually, you know, the Duke of Somerset is living in Rouen with his wife and children at the time it falls. He is forced to capitulate to Charles VII of France as part of the English surrender, which then means all of the other English captains of France also have to kind of come out of their castles and submit to French overlordship, which we know the Duke of York, for instance, finds very offensive, because he's sort of being forced into a position he didn't want by someone who's a rival for power. But, I mean, the buck stops with Henry, really. The big problem is that he has a desire for peace, which, you know, shouldn't be a problem, but is in this context. He has a desire for peace almost at all costs. So he gives up the Duke of Orleans, for instance, who has been kept prisoner of war in England since the Battle of Agincourt and is a very important bargaining chip, but he just sort of gives him away. He gives away Maine as part of his marriage to Margaret of Anjou, who is a French princess. He cedes lots of other territory. He doesn't notice when, like, certain allies are listed on the wrong side on charters. Like, there's just inattention, I would say. And as you said right at the start, like, they've run out of money. They can't afford to keep mounting these campaigns. They're incredibly expensive and no one wants to be there, really. And that inevitably, I think, leads to a bit of elbowing among the leading figures of Henry's court. But up until 1450, kind of the leading one becomes the Duke of Suffolk, who has a very important kind of like father figure role for Henry.
Probably the most controversial and maybe the best known is Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. I find him really fascinating, especially because of the scandal that involves his wife and witchcraft, which ultimately sees her I think in having a lifetime imprisonment on the Isle of Man. What was going on here?
I think it might be Anglesey rather than the Isle of Man, but I may be misremembering. Yes, she is Eleanor Cobham, and I mean, everything about Gloucester is quite fascinating. That's also why the book is very long, is because there's like a whole 20-year period before Henry even really properly has power, in which these fascinating, complicated figures are all manoeuvring among each other. So Gloucester marries Eleanor Cobham, having divorced his previous wife, who was a very important princess of the Low Countries, and just sort of abandoned her there. She's probably an English servant, basically. And it's a little bit contested what exactly is happening in the 1440s. It is claimed that she is using necromancy and priests who have turned to the dark arts and prophecy, and she's using images of Henry VI that she melts in order to sort of reduce Henry, and it's alleged to kill him so that Gloucester, her husband, can take the throne in his place. When she is questioned about this, she says this isn't true. She's just sort of trying to find out what's going on with the prophecies, and these little images that they're saying are of Henry are actually of babies, and she's trying to get pregnant. Like, it's a really poignant bit of testimony. However, like, there's no way around it. Like, clearly she is trying to impact the succession to the throne at a time when everything is very tense. Henry's still not married at this point. And so she is imprisoned for life. She's forcibly divorced from Gloucester, but also she's made to do the Cersei Lannister penitential walk around London 3 times in her nightie, and take lit candles to different church altars on market days. Like, a really, I mean, horrible humiliation for a duchess to have to do that. And it's interesting that Henry, who is so quick to forgive most people, does not forgive her, and he won't hear about her again. There's a woman who comes up and sort of lambasts him on Blackheath one time and is like, you should release Eleanor Cobham, let her out. And he has her pressed to death.
Yeah.
Like, he really, I mean, presumably that's partly because being pressed to death is usually at this time if you've not given a plea, so presumably she didn't plea in the court case, it wasn't inevitable. But that's the level of, like, sensitivity politically and I think, like, residual anger or hurt or betrayal that Henry feels towards her for doing that.
Yeah, and so I think for Henry to react in that way is quite telling. That I think maybe clearly Eleanor Cobham was maybe one of the few examples in history where she was genuinely guilty of what she was being accused of. For Henry to react in such a uncharacteristic way.
Yeah, potentially. I believe her. I believe that the image magic stuff was probably for procreation.
Yeah.
I do think, though, that she was trying to find out if Henry would die so that she could, whether she was trying to bring it about, I think she was trying to know. And that is, you know, a bit questionable in terms of heretical activity in the 1440s. And it really taints Gloucester at a time when him and Henry have already fallen out over Henry's peace policy towards France. Gloucester is still like, no, let's keep fighting. And Henry's trying to make peace desperately. And ultimately this leads to Gloucester's complete fall from favour. And he is about to be arrested for treason in 1447 at a parliament when he suddenly dies, which I don't think there is anything suspicious going on. Like, they display his body, there's no signs of anything having happened to him. And also it does just seem to happen throughout history that you have these really powerful individuals, particularly men, and when they are confronted with, you are probably going to face the consequences of your actions, they die, like almost just out of annoyance. Yeah, exactly. Thomas Wolsey is a really good example. John Beaufort, the father of Margaret Beaufort, is another example. It just seems to happen.
So at what point does Margaret of Anjou, or Marguerite of Anjou as she's probably called, when does she enter the scene, and was Henry directly involved in selecting her as his bride? He
was definitely involved in choosing brides in general, because we know that there was the possibility of a marriage to the princesses of Armagnac. And he sends people with quite specific instructions about trying to paint them in their kirtles. So that is like not wearing all of their layers of clothing, so that he can actually kind of get a sense of their figures, probably, as well as their faces.
That sounds quite uncharacteristic of Henry as well.
Well, I think this is part of the problem, though, is that the records we have for Henry are either from really late in his life, when he's sort of being pitched as a kind of hero saint figure, and it's all about how chaste he was, and he never wore fancy clothes, and he hated plays, both of which are lies. Like, there is evidence that he wore fancy clothes and that he enjoyed plays, so nonsense. And there's also some sources from the 1430s, like 10 years before he gets married, that say he's monkish and very chaste, which I think probably is correct. But you would sort of expect that of someone who's growing up in this Lancastrian tradition. Like Henry V, also very famously chaste, didn't have illegitimate children, didn't have mistresses as far as we know. So, yeah, I think Henry was interested, and I think he was interested because it was a legitimate outlet for any sexual interest he might have had. I think he also didn't know what he was doing, but that's a sort of a separate issue. So I do think he was involved, and in particular, I think he was involved in choosing Margaret because the person sent to arrange the marriage is the Duke of Suffolk. So Henry's like most trusted ally at this point. And I don't think it's just for a political reason. I think it is also that he's sent to see if this queen will suit Henry. And Margaret of Anjou, the marriage is arranged in 1444. She's 14 probably at that point. Henry's in his early 20s. She's the niece of King Charles VII of France. And she's really interesting because unlike Henry, who never sees kingship in action at all, she has grown up watching people rule. And in particular, she's grown up watching women rule in the absence of men. So her mother and her grandmother both rule over their territories, defend them militarily, defend them politically, because her father is often away fighting or being a prisoner during that period of time. So she is very experienced, clearly very clever. She's an intellectual patron later on, very interested in reading, interested in hunting. Like there's a lot there that seems like, yes, this would be the person you would choose. The big problem as far as England is concerned is she doesn't have a lot of money. So that's what they need at this. They need a lot of money. And Margaret sort of gets blamed for the fact that she doesn't bring money. She's expected to like cause a beautiful peace because, you know, England and France united in marriage. Surely there'll be an end to the 100 Years' War. That doesn't happen. It's expected she'll have a child quickly. That doesn't happen. So I think she sort of gets blamed for a lot of things that are like institutional problems with the Lancastrians at this point.
Yeah, things that are beyond her control, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, probably beyond the control of almost any 15-year-old foreign queen. Yeah.
Yeah. I love Margaret of Anjou. I think she's so fascinating. She'd definitely be on my, you know, if you can have your dream dinner party guests from history, she'd be on there.
Yeah,
no
absolutely.
doubt about it.
And she's not been taken seriously, I think, like especially the last 10 years of Henry's life. When really Margaret is not only militarily but diplomatically the absolute linchpin of the Lancastrians. Like she is the one driving everything, and she just hasn't been looked at enough.
So probably one of the most famous parts of Henry's story is the periods in which he appears to suffer from a severe mental breakdown or a psychological break, with one resulting in, I suppose, what is sometimes described as almost like a catatonic stupor. So firstly, can you explain to me what you believe actually caused this? And then from your reading of the sources, what do you think actually happened to him?
First of all, I will say, I think I have looked at every single source there is about this period and Henry's illness, and there are not many. So I think people have to be really cautious. I mean, in general, from having, because I spoke to quite a few historians of medicine, and in general, they very much were like, no, in the modern day, we discourage retrospective diagnosis because it can't be done. And I think Henry has been retrospectively diagnosed a lot, and particularly as schizophrenic. That seems to be the thing. There's this diagnostic book of medicine where you can kind of go through and be like, oh, yes, he had that symptom, so therefore he must have had this disease. And you can't do it with Henry. There is not enough evidence. And what there is very questionable. So, for instance, people have made a lot of the fact that his confessor, John Blackman, who writes a biography of him, describes him having what we would call like auditory and visual hallucinations, but what he describes as like he sees Jesus in the Mass. He hears voices warning him of danger that he realizes are saints. He has a vision of a woman murdering her child and intercedes to stop it happening. Like, yes, we would say, wow, hallucinations. But in the 15th century, people wrote about things in such a literal way. Like, you know, angels did appear to them. And actually, for hundreds of years after, William Blake describes angels sitting in trees. So we can't take that, I think, as being evidence for anything. What we do know is that contemporary chronicles describe him in summer 1453 being smitten with a frenzy and then essentially just collapsing. And he disappears completely from view. There isn't really much information about what he's doing. There isn't much information about where he is. He seems to be at Windsor for a while. Margaret of Anjou gives birth to their son during this period. And Henry, there's a description of Henry being introduced to the son and sort of looking at him but not responding in any way. There's the fact that the Chancellor dies during this period, and that means that like government completely collapses because no one's in charge of things. So they make the Duke of York protector. So there is clearly enough serious about this illness that it is felt that Henry cannot rule. And then he sort of suddenly emerges and is like, oh, I'm awake.
On Christmas Day, I want to say as well.
That's the story. But there seem to be some signs that he was recovering from September onwards. Okay. Because he is involved in giving the kiss of peace to a bishop, things like that, king things. What I did is looked at some of the commissions for his doctors that exist. So like the list of things they were allowed to do for Henry. And basically they're allowed to do anything. Like that was the long and short of it. Like there was no real sense that, okay, there's this very specific thing that they are targeting that's, they think he's overly affected by humours or they think he's overly affected by something else. Like it's almost anything. It's like, have a nice bath, shave your head, have cupping and scarring, have a lie down. It's just so scattershot that I just think they didn't know. And again, the only other thing I can think is there's a description of him being like brought out of a room by two people who were attending him. And it sounds like he's sort of being carried. So like all of that adds up to, I think, he had a profound depression and we would say a psychotic break. So it manifested as him just completely like disassociating almost for a period of time. And I completely understand it because like in the 3 years before that, he'd had the Duke of York consistently like trying, even by military means, to take control of government. He had the assassination of 6 of his leading advisors, like people who to him were family, I would say, and Gilles of Brittany, who always gets forgotten about, being horribly murdered over there for supporting Henry. And I think it's really important that this happens at the time that his wife is pregnant for the first time, as far as we know. And of course, surely there must have been something in Henry's mind that was like, my father died when I was born. There must have been something there, however unconscious, that connected paternity and death. That would have been affecting him. So I just think it's like it's a really complicated array of horrible things were happening to him, and he just tried to get himself out of it.
Do you think, though, that there's been much made of the fact, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think it is his maternal grandfather, the French king, who thought he was made of glass at one point. Is that correct?
Yes, Charles VI of France, yeah.
Yeah, so there's this argument that there was a mental illness was a part of that family line. Do you sort of truck with that, or do you think they are?
I don't. I did look into it, and actually, what's interesting is for Charles VI, we have way more information because the sources written at the time were written by court contemporaries who were witnessing things, and with him, if you wish to go through the diagnostic checklist for schizophrenia, it's ding, 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 ding for Charles VI. Interestingly, the being made of glass is a thing the Pope says, and I'm not completely convinced by it. But we do know that he's pulling down heraldry. He's calling himself George. There's something about a lion at one point. He thinks assassins are chasing him. But yeah, Charles VI I'm absolutely manic episodes. And what's very distressing actually when you read about Charles VI is he would have these periods in which he'd be like, I'm not washing, no one's going to catch me, I'm going to run around screaming into walls. And then he would recover and he would realise what had happened. And it was very upsetting to him. And he saw it as being bewitched. He said, whoever's bewitched me, just stop because it's too awful. But like none of those things match what Henry VI exhibits. So I mean, for a start, I think both of them are child kings, and it messes you up psychologically.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I don't think there is a inherited trait there.
And in that window in which Henry has this psychotic break, or however we're going to look at it, it's painted often as him being completely unable to do anything for himself, be it eat, go to the loo. I mean, again, from the scant evidence, is this true?
I think it is probably true, because there's a chronicle reference to him sort of being unable to do anything, to walk, to lift his head. Yeah, so I think probably he was for a time physically incapacitated. But again, that is possible in some very extreme forms of depression.
So leading up to this, and in this window, with Henry being out of action, as it were, that Richard of York, the Duke of York, truly emerges as the man who felt he could lead England and ultimately supersede Henry as King of England. Before getting into his story per se, can you just explain Richard's claim to the throne and why...
God, can I?
Why it could be argued it was actually senior to Henry's?
Yes. They are both descended from Edward III. Henry is descended... I never get it the right way round. I'm so sorry. Henry is descended from a younger but male line. York is descended from an elder but female line. It should be said, there's quite a lot of people, though, who are descended from Edward III. But yes, it is completely fair that the Duke of York is recognised at the time as being sort of one of the absolute leading figures in terms of like precedent.
And at what point does he go full on, I am the rightful king? And did he have widespread support in that?
I have a bit of a feeling that like in 1450, when there's all these assassinations of Henry's leading advisors, including the Duke of Suffolk, York suddenly comes back to England just after there's been Cade's rebellion, there's been an enormous amount of turmoil, and he comes back from having been lieutenant in Ireland, sort of proclaiming himself the champion of the Commons, and almost as if he's going to be the one to put everything right. And what I find interesting with that particular moment in time is we have quite a few documents back and forth between York and Henry, which are put out publicly, in which essentially it's the Duke of York saying, I'm the champion of the people, don't you worry, now that Suffolk's gone, I'll look after everything. And Henry going, I'm the king. No, thank you. It's fine. And York again being like, no, it's absolutely, I'll take on this burden for myself. The people are behind me. Henry insisting he is in control. That's the point. And a pattern is set from that moment onwards where Henry recognises, or certainly the people around Henry, the Duke of Somerset, Margaret of Anjou, they recognise that York sees himself as deserving power and deserving authority over government, and Henry is uncomfortable with it. And it's interesting that is set in stone almost like right from that moment through pretty much the next 10 years. I don't think that York was trying to be king until very late on in the 1450s, but I do think he was trying to rule through Henry. And as much as Henry was saying no, York was not listening, and he was kind of seeing it as, oh, it's the Duke of Somerset, it's his malign influence, and later, oh, it's Margaret of Anjou, it's her malign influence. And actually, I think it was Henry. I think those other people were absolutely bolstering him, but I think it was Henry himself did not like the way that the Duke of York was with him. So yeah, I'd say it takes many years for York to kind of outright say, okay, if you're not going to give me power like that, I'll take it for myself.
He is eventually killed, either in battle or possibly captured and beheaded. I think thanks in no small part to Shakespeare, it is Margaret of Anjou who is repeatedly viewed as the villain of the piece, the she-wolf of France, as some have called her. How much truth is there in this, or is it straight up 15th, 16th century sexism.
Well, no one at the time says that. Like, Margaret of Anjou is nowhere near Wakefield when York dies. That's the key fact. It's like, we know where she is. She's not there. So she's not, putting him on an anthill and mocking him and, holding up his son's bloody handkerchief and, things that Shakespeare puts in.
Paper crown on his head and all that stuff.
Yes. I mean, to be fair, I think he does get a paper crown stuffed on his head, but it's not Margaret doing it. And again, it's it completely makes sense for dramatic purposes. But again, the history is just more complicated. And what tends to get forgotten about, because Margaret is a very good leader of people, what gets forgotten about is that you have an entire coterie of Lancastrians, lots of them whose brothers or fathers have been killed by the Yorkists, and whose lands have been threatened by them, who hate the Duke of York, hate him and the Earl of Warwick in a way that I don't think Margaret does for a very long time. I think she sees him increasingly as a threat. And at the start, when you were saying, when would you go in time? Another point in history I'd be fascinated to see is the First Battle of St Albans of 1455. Because for me, that is another essential turning point in history where the Yorkists essentially run through the streets murdering the Lancastrians. As much as I can completely see the Yorkist point of view in terms of how they're being ostracised and alienated from power, I don't think there's any other way to see it except they're assassinating their rivals in the streets, and Henry is wounded. I'm absolutely convinced that leads to another mental collapse. And it also means that you have all of these young men who are like, well, you murdered my dad, so I don't like you. And I think it's also that Margaret then goes, well, you wounded my husband, so I don't like you. I think there's really human motivations here. But I think Margaret does try to work with York a little bit longer than we give her credit for. And I think the Yorkists, and especially the Earl of Warwick, I'd say, who's the spin doctor of the Yorkists, as far as I'm concerned, I think they start attacking Margaret in propaganda terms by the 1450s. I think they've started spreading rumours about her being an adulterer and suppressing Henry, that he's very henpecked and that her son and Henry's son is not really theirs. They're spreading those rumours because they've recognised that Margaret and her son are the two real figureheads of the cause by the late 1450s. Henry is just becoming more and more irrelevant.
And obviously, where York fails, his son, Edward, Earl of March, succeeds. He manages to oust Henry from the throne and becomes King Edward IV. So in the early years of Edward IV's reign, what happened to Henry?
Oh, Henry, yes. I mean, essentially what happens is that for 3-4 years, so 1461 through to 64-ish, there is a continuing Lancastrian resistance. First they go to Scotland, then some of them are abroad. They come back to Northumberland, and there's a number of sieges there of some of the big castles of Northumberland. There is a very real Lancastrian resistance to Edward IV in the north. Which ultimately, unfortunately, comes to nothing. And at the Battle of Hexham, most of those sort of Lancastrians are sort of wiped out, effectively, or driven into exile. And then Henry has a very weird year in which he disappears. He's just living in the wilderness with a couple of his attendants. No one really knows where he is. No one knows what he's doing. And then he turns up at someone's house in Lancashire in 1465, is betrayed, captured, and escorted back to London with his feet tied to his horse, and he's imprisoned for the next 5 years. And that's why Margaret and her son become the leading figures for the Lancastrians then.
And obviously the throne then flip-flops in October 1470, with it being pulled from under the feet of Edward IV back over to Henry VI, only for Henry VI to be deposed again 6 months later. Now, upon Edward IV reclaiming the throne, this time he isn't taking any chances, and Henry is imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he would die, officially speaking, on the 21st of May, 1471. What do you think happened to him?
Oh, I think he was murdered. Like, I've got absolutely no doubt in my mind. The official Yorkist line is that he dies of melancholy. And I think there's a legacy there again of the mental health aspect of Henry, that I think it was quite easy to tar him at that point as suffering from mental problems that could lead to him literally dying of sadness. And his son had just died in battle. His wife had been captured. The cause was lost. But a late 1470s chronicler, the Warkworth Chronicle, records him being taken through the streets open-visaged, is how it's described, which suggests to me that he's not, the rest of his body is suspiciously concealed, and that his body is seen to bleed at various points. And I, like, the big thing, the compelling argument for me in terms of Henry being murdered is that not a single time in his life does he do something that is convenient for other people. And it is so monumentally convenient that he dies at that exact moment. Like, the only reason he was kept alive for so long was because his son was a teenager and was much more military minded. And they were like, well, we need to get rid of the son because, like, he's the problem here. If we keep Henry around, actually, the Lancastrians are a bit hamstrung because they're going to have to stick with Henry for longer. And when the son's dead, that's it. Henry is completely useless. So, yeah, I'm convinced he was murdered.
And because there's also a theory that the person who murdered him was Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III. Is that a theory that has weight? Well,
again, the place it comes from is the Warkworth Chronicle, and that is written from memory in 1478. So it's written a long time before Richard kind of, gets a bit of a bad rep in the 1480s for the way that he accedes to the throne. And I would say it doesn't specify that Gloucester kills Henry. It just says there were lots of people in the tower. One of them was the Duke of Gloucester. However, he is the only person named, which to me is quite interesting, I think. And we know that Gloucester played a big part in the aftermath of the Battle of Tewkesbury, when loads of Lancastrians were pulled out of sanctuary and executed. He was the constable. He was in charge of overseeing that process. So it is believable to me that he was viewed at the time, whether rightly or wrongly, as something of a hard man for Edward IV.
Is the notion that the House of York was extremely popular actually true, or was Henry VI himself actually quite beloved by his people? I suppose in a way that isn't portrayed in modern historical fiction, like the White Queen and the Hollow Crown and so on.
I think Henry was completely beloved. I think it's the only thing that explains why people stick with him for so long. Like, even in 1460, when the Act of Accord is sort of forced through, which is where the Duke of York is declared the heir to the throne at last, people are still not willing to depose Henry. They're like, no, York can have it after Henry's gone. I think, the way I always envisage it is like, any time that you have seen, quite a sweet person grow up from being a baby, you have a different feeling towards them and you have a different concern for them. And Henry was a genuinely nice person. It's just he was really bad at being a medieval king. So I think he was beloved. And what's interesting is that during Edward IV's reign, again, there's chronicle references to how people started to go, oh, wasn't it better under Henry? Didn't we have a better time? Which is mad because they didn't. But like, it's really interesting that the English start doing that.
I know this is a question that's hard to answer, but do you think that the early death of Henry's father, the absence of a true father, was the biggest fundamental issue of his life?
Oh, gosh, that is such a good question, because it's a nature-nurture question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think by nature, Henry VI was different from Henry V. I think if Henry
V had been around.
Yeah, I think if Henry V had been around, firstly, Henry VI would have seen what it meant to be a king. And crucially, he might have had some brothers. And if he had some brothers, then Henry VI could have done what Henry V did. He could have gone to make war in France. He could have had that military experience that most of his male peers did at that time, but that he could not do because there just weren't enough Lancastrians around. Like, they needed to keep Henry safe. He couldn't be risked in battle. So yeah, I think the absence of Henry V is hugely important, but I'm not totally convinced that Henry VI would have fundamentally been a different person.
So my final question for you then is whether ultimately you think Henry VI was sort of born in the wrong century. From reading your book and from hearing you speak, it sounds like he'd have been a really great constitutional monarch, just not a medieval one.
Oh, yeah. I think, like, swap him and William III. Like, William III, I don't have any time for at all. But put him in the 15th century, he probably would have been quite good, you know. And absolutely, I mean, Henry VI is everything Charles III would like to be, I think. You know, he's like the peacemaker. He loves making friends with people. His idea of making peace is that you literally get all of your people who don't like each other to come and hold hands and walk through London. You know, that's ideal. That's what we want. And very good on public occasions.
Oh, well, thank you very much for coming back onto the podcast. This has been really fun. So for those who want to keep up to date with what you do, where are you at across social media?
That's a good question. I'm at history_Lauren on Instagram, which is the main place I hang out. And I'm historylauren.co.uk is my website, which has got my events and things coming up.
Wonderful. As we said at the start, you've got your book about Margaret Beaufort coming out imminently. What's it called? Remind me.
It's Margaret Beaufort, Survivor, Rebel, Kingmaker.
Amazing. And are you able to say what you're working on next, if you are?
Mainly at the minute, I'm trying to do my PhD that I've been doing for about 9 years. No, that's a lie. For a bit less than that, which is all about Tudor Catholic exiles and what they do in Europe, what they do in relation to Rome. You know, I think it's quite timely to be looking at English people abroad and how they were viewed, rather than, you know, the sort of constant concept of English people themselves being inundated with any sort of immigrant presence. So, yeah, it's quite interesting to me.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much again for coming back on the podcast, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Thanks, Adam.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and a big thank you to Lauren for joining me again on the podcast. Next week, I'm thrilled to be speaking to philosopher Susan Bordeaux for the first time, all about her remarkable book, The Creation of Anne Boleyn, in which we will explore the many myriad ways the most famous of Henry VIII's wives has been portrayed in film and television, in literature, and how this has all come to shape how we perceive her story in the modern era. That will drop next Thursday. If you've got any suggestions for future podcast episodes, please do reach out to me via Instagram at The Tudor Chest. I would love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chest podcast, and speak to you next week.